But one thing we have to recognize is that at the time, everybody was desperate for as many as possible of their loved ones to be still alive to see that happy day. I do not believe there was one family in America or Britain who would have said it was worth the lives of their soldiers to get to Berlin before the Russians. It was the Russians who were so ruthless that they were prepared to take the losses for Berlin. And almost every man in the Western Allied armies would have said, if they want it that badly, let them do the dying. And they did indeed do the dying.
As the Soviets were losing vast numbers of men in their attempt to capture the German capital, Adolf Hitler was hiding in the Führer bunker. On the 30th of April, with his capture inevitable, he committed suicide, and his body was burnt. His own obsession with conquering the Soviet Union had brought about his downfall, and his defeat in World War II had been assured by the forces of his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin.
The Hitler-Stalin conflict is a study of, I would say, two psychopaths who managed to achieve control of two major countries. This is a terrible coincidence. Hitler by his rhetoric and Stalin by sheer cunning, raising himself from a mere gopher for the revolution to become the chairman of the party and the exterminator of every other political rival, so that two great nations are finally governed entirely by the whims of two figures who have no concept of remorse and are prepared to risk the lives of millions to achieve a sort of fanciful aim.
Well, it's wrong to talk about the Second World War as if it was a conventional war in which rational military considerations play an important part. You have to measure success in war by the aims of the war. And Hitler's war aims were in no sense rational. This is a war of racial extermination, a war driven by paranoid conspiracist fantasies. The Holocaust was a war aim, it wasn't some kind of sideshow. All of these things were bound up together in his racist, destructive, murderous vision of politics born out of the First World War. There's nothing much rational about them.
Nobody saw it then with the clarity that it afterwards emerged, but of course the lines that were drawn in those last days and weeks of the Second World War defined the shape of Europe for the course of the Cold War. That Churchill did understand many months before he delivered his Iron Curtain speech, that an Iron Curtain was indeed descending, that all those people whom the Red Army claimed that they liberated in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Poland were not being liberated. They were merely exchanging the tyranny of Hitler for the tyranny of Stalin. And that's now clear to us. We can see that, but it wasn't so clear at the time.
I think that the paradox of the Second World War in some ways, we may think that we were fighting for democracy and freedom or whatever, but actually we ended up with half of Europe liberated and half of Europe under a new totalitarian regime. So, you know, did good triumph or did evil triumph? All we know is that when it comes to assessing the clash between two totalitarian regimes like the Nazis and the communists, Andrei Sakharov came up with the right formula, I think.
The Russians, never.
By early 1945, Germany had lost all the territory it had gained since the beginning of World War II, and its own borders were now being approached on both sides.
All-out smash on Germany. The Red Army striking for Berlin. American forces sweeping across the Rhine in breathtaking operations inside the Nazi West Wall.
The very day after the Americans managed to capture the bridge over the Rhine, Stalin knew that he had to move very, very quickly indeed. And this is where he summoned both Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konev to Moscow to prepare the attack on Berlin. Stalin knew perfectly well that he had to surround Berlin. He was terrified because the Americans had already got to the River Elbe on the other side, and they could actually get to Berlin more quickly if they'd wanted to. Partly because all of the SS troops were already, and all of the best armed troops were facing the Soviet side on the Eastern Front, while the troops on the Western Front were surrendering to the Americans as rapidly as possible because they wanted to be a prisoner of war of the Americans rather than of the Russians. In Berlin, the great story at the time was, or the great joke at the time was, you know, optimists were learning English and pessimists were learning Russian. So not surprisingly, there was a willingness to give in that particular way.
The jaws of a giant